Prime Minister Mark Carney laid out new measures to protect Canadian steel and aluminum today, an industry facing tight pressure under U.S. tariffs now at 50%. If there's no deal between Canada and the U.S. at the end of the 30-day deadline discussed at the G7, Canada will impose counter-tariffs on July 21st. In the meantime, there will be new procurement measures to encourage the use of domestic supply and a quota on foreign steel, limiting the amount of steel from countries without a trade agreement with Canada. The steel industry, however, says these measures fall short of what is needed. I'm joined now by Industry Minister Mélanie Joly. Minister, it's good to see you. Thank you for coming in today.
Good to see you, David. Thank you.
Let's start with the 30-day timeline before retaliation. What's your level of optimism that something will get done in the next 30 days or by the 16th of July?
This is a question that every single journalist asks me or the Prime Minister. And of course, my answer is always the same. We won't negotiate in public. We'll let the Prime Minister do his work. But I think, we have to make sure that we're continuing to negotiate, but we're ready also as we know, we're in a trade war. We know that the economy is the battlefield and they're front lines right now. And I know you want to talk about that, but the front lines are steel, aluminum, and auto.
Right. But when, the U.S. ambassador, or the ambassador to the U.S., Kirsten Hillman and Dominic LeBlanc came out of the meetings at the G7 saying, we felt an acceleration, we've been told to accelerate it. When you set a deadline, either enough is enough and it's time to draw a line in the sand, or you think you can get something done by then, or both. How do you view it?
I'll let the folks in charge of the negotiation do their work. I think that indeed, as mentioned, we now have a clearer process. And at the same time, we're the country that has imposed the most counter tariffs. We're the country that is the biggest client of the U.S. because we buy more from the Americans than China, Japan, the U.K. and France. So it gives us leverage. Our countermeasures are hurting in key states that are linked to President Trump's base, particularly red states. But at the same time, everybody doing the work of not buying American right now, making sure that we're supporting Canadian products and basically businesses and workers is fundamental. So I decided to leave the diplomatic front to go to the economic front of the trade war. And I'm seeing how much there's work to be done, and that's what we're doing right now.
Okay, well, there have already been hundreds of jobs lost in steel and more in aluminum. In this package outlined today, there's no direct specific measures for those workers. I know there have been changes made to EI previously to waive waiting periods and make it easier to qualify, but there are task force set up. I mean, how quickly are people going to see concrete measures there? Because there could be a lot of jobs lost in the next month.
There hasn't been layoffs on the aluminum side, and there's been some layoffs on the steel side. The two issues are completely different.
Right.
Okay, I've been in contact with all the three sectors, including auto, and they're all linked. But I must say, right now, the issue is much more in the steel sector. I've been in contact with the president of ArcelorMittal Dofasco, with the president of Stelco, the president of Algoma Steel this morning again in Sault Ste. Marie, and also with the president of many other different plants across the country. So I'm very open to their comments regarding making sure that there's not any form of dumping through different countries that could be third countries of steel that is basically being not following fair trade practices, to say the least. So we'll continue to have that conversation. Today was an important package. Why? Because it addresses the short, middle, and longer term issues. Short term, we need to close the market. How we do that? We're willing to continue to have conversations. The second is midterm liquidities and making sure that companies are able to get through the crisis. Conversations and negotiations have already started, particularly with some companies. And then longer term, it's the future of having steel in Canada. And for sure, we will have steel in Canada. It's fundamental to our economy. It's fundamental to our manufacturing sector. It's fundamental to our national security. We're doing three things. First, we will impose Canadian steel and aluminum in major projects. Second, in the defense procurement, absolutely. Canadian companies or foreign companies selling us defense procurement, defense equipment will have to take Canadian steel and aluminum, and also we'll make sure that in our deals that to attract foreign direct investments, we'll put conditions into.
Right, but we have a statement from the Canadian steel producers and the United Steel Workers Union saying that they believe what is in this package today falls short of what our industry needs at this most challenging time. So like the point that with 700 plus steel jobs already gone, there's no sort of sector-specific package for them beyond the EI changes. And they point to, as I understand it, some of the import restrictions on steel that the quota tariff rates, excuse me.
The tariffs, yes.
Yes, it limits imports from countries we don't have a trade agreement with to 2024 levels. They already feel the 2024 levels were pretty high, and some of the bad actors that they've pointed to in the past in sort of bringing in cheap steel and kind of dumping it here, South Korea, Vietnam, because they have trade agreements with Canada, they're not affected by this at all. So they're not getting kind of the protections they were looking for. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think we have to look at the details of this because we include also another condition that is the steel needs to be melted and poured in Canada.
Yes.
So that's also something that is that the industry needs to be able to assess.
This is the country of melt and pour issue.
Exactly.
So this is to stop like Chinese steel going through South Korea to get into Canada? Is it that sort of thing?
That's the idea. Now, what we want to do is to continue the conversations because, of course, we want to protect these jobs. Of course, we want to make sure that we have an industry, a steel industry. And my job as industry minister is to fight for these jobs and to fight for these plants. And that's what I'll do. I've been on the phone a lot over the past few days to make sure that we land at a good place. I understand that there's still concerns, and we'll be in solution mode.
You know, the 30-day period, wherever this goes, I mean, the industry has been saying for a while that it's potentially thousands of jobs that could start to go in that time frame if the 50% tariffs aren't lifted, because they lost a few hundred at 25, but after that, it's not linear, it's exponential, and their ability to ride it out is extremely limited. Yeah,
you're talking about 30-day for countermeasures, which is different. We're talking about much more closing or limiting the market to make sure that we have a stronger domestic market to protect our plants.
I understand, but those are medium-term to long-term solutions in some cases, like the defense procurement. Like Algoma, more than half of its product goes into the U.S., right? So at a 50% tariff, it's just not sustainable.
So I hear you. And clearly what the U.S. is doing is completely unacceptable. And we will fight these tariffs because they're completely legal, they're completely unjustified. And so that's why we need to make sure that we get to a good place to protect our domestic market, like I was mentioning, on the quotas. I think that, and I think we're getting to a good place. I'm quite positive. And I think we can get to a good place very quickly. I think also that some plants had issues before this crisis and need to be helped, and we will help them. And at the same time, we need to be prepared for many scenarios. As the geopolitics of this and the unpredictability coming out of the White House is a fact. And so based on that, we will take measures like we've never done since we had free trade agreements to protect these jobs, to make sure that we have a domestic market, like I was saying. And at the same time, we want to make sure that certain plants are able to pivot to make sure that they are able to do the type of steel that is necessary for a defense sector, which is not the case necessarily right now. There's an interdependency between steel and the auto sector in Canada. We need to make sure that the steel is able to be in a way ready to help our major projects, and at the same time the defense sector. And meanwhile, the auto sector needs to continue, and we need to work together. And we have a $2 billion fund to support the auto sector. But I want to make sure that while we look at these sectors separately, we look at them working together as well.
Right, and I get the strategy there because, you know, the White House has unleashed a wave of protectionism around the world that industries are forced to just adapt to.
Yeah.
But this is going to take some time, right? So, like, what's the timeline you see for that sort of pivot? You know, where Canadian steel can be reoriented towards a defense supply chain that we're kind of just starting to build as a country, right? This is not the sort of thing, I mentioned the 30-day time frame. I know that's for countermeasures, but that 30 days at 50% tariffs for these companies is going to be rough.
Well,
the transition is going to take months, years.
That's why we have a One Canadian Economy bill. That's why we want to, you know, people have been asking why this urgency of passing through this legislation. There is urgency. People will potentially be losing their jobs. So we're fighting every day to make sure that we keep these plants open, that we're working with the unions to keep the jobs, to make sure, meanwhile, that we attract foreign direct investments in different sectors that are linked to the manufacturing sector. It's the future of jobs in the trade that is right now not only at risk, but actually could be potentially a great opportunity, because we'll have so many different major infrastructure projects and so many investments in aerospace, in auto, because of defense procurement. So that's why we want to speed this up. That's why I'm extremely impatient and not sleeping enough at night. That's why I wanted this job, because I knew that our people would be potentially at risk. And I'm seeing it all around the world. The most important thing is ultimately people having a job and their family being able to, you know, put, like we say in French, butter and bread on the table. So that's why this is a first response to the steel and aluminum crisis. We will be working on other different types of solutions. We're really open. I'm absolutely open to make sure that the government plays its role. And not only that, we will make sure that not only the companies also do their role, but we will work with union, because this is a question of ultimately keeping the trust between people and their government.
Just as a final point, Minister, that sort of bigger picture restructuring you were talking about there, linking steel with auto, defense, and all of these things, you know, conceptually, it reminds me of the conversation that the country had after COVID, when it was like, we can't trust China for masks, we can't trust them for medical supplies, we need to build industrial capacity domestically.
Absolutely.
And there was that shift. You know, those are more niche products than sort of like steel and auto, but if we do have to, as a country, pivot to this more of a domestic integration, seems like that is going to drive up costs, right? Because, you know, part of the benefits of the trade order has been to bring prices down. I mean, is that what the country needs to prepare for and consumers need to prepare for? Because forced on us by the United States, no question, but is that where you see it going?
I think it's a very good question. And that is exactly what's happening in the U.S. Inflation is going to rise. And right now, on average, an American is bearing 20% tariff, so a 20% tax against him or her. So meanwhile, we have to do two things. We need to make sure that we continue to have free trade agreements with the EU and many other countries, which we have free trade agreements, to make sure, to your point, that costs are down. But in certain sectors, including, of course, the steel, aluminum, and auto sector, we need to make sure that we protect our workers. And this is indeed protectionism, because the trade war has been launched, and ultimately it's a question not only of protecting the jobs, like I was saying, but it's a question of sovereignty, of being able to not be dependent on the US to build things in Canada. And that's why we're coming up with a plan to build Canada with major projects, with defense procurement. So it's all linked. I know for you know, people watching us right now, it seems that there's a big complexity to all of this. It's the impact of, right now, the White House taking its decisions and Canada deciding to be closer and less dependent on the US and closer to Europe and closer to certain Asian countries. And yes, negotiations on the free trade agreement with the US is important, but I think we should all bear in mind that the mindset of trade in the world has changed. And so we need to have a built-in Canada plan, and that's what this government is doing.
But it does seem the prices will rise as a result of this, because security and self-sufficiency often comes at a cost. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing.
That is why we're cutting taxes, and that is why that was our first bill, to make sure that we can continue to have this social safety net with pharmacare, with dental care, with childcare. But at the same time, we know that things are costing too much. It's been tough, and so that's why we're cutting taxes, and we're working on all these fronts.
Okay, I've gone over time. Industry Minister Mélanie Joly, appreciate you. Thanks for coming in.
We must reinforce our strength at home and safeguard Canadian workers and businesses from the unjust U.S. tariffs that exist at present. Steel and aluminum workers are on the front lines of this trade crisis. These are the workers who will help us build one strong Canadian economy, the strongest economy in the G7.
More than 2 weeks after U.S. President Donald Trump raised his steel and aluminum tariffs to 50%, Prime Minister Mark Carney has announced his response. The Prime Minister says Canada will raise its counter tariffs as well, but he did not say to what level. And it wouldn't happen until July 21st at the earliest, to give Canada and the U.S. time to negotiate a new trade deal. Now, the Prime Minister did announce immediate measures that will help favor Canadian steel and aluminum suppliers over foreign suppliers, but is that enough? The Steel Association says it's not. We're going to start there with the Power Panel. Jonathan Kalis was a Quebec advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. James Moore is a former Conservative cabinet minister. Cheryl Oates was the director of communications to former Alberta NDP Premier Rachel Notley. And Shachi Kurl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. Happy Thursday, everyone. It's good to see you there. James, what did you make of this response today from the Prime Minister? Giving negotiations time, but setting a date for countermeasures, but supports that the industry and the unions in the steel sector say falls a bit short right now?
Yeah, there was more to the announcement than that. I know it's complicated and you're trying to summarize it, but I also think putting together a roundtable of experts in both steel and aluminum and separating the two sectors apart, I think is wise policy, because the market pressures and the trade pressures on the aluminum sector versus the steel sector are actually quite different, and setting them apart was smart. I did get the feeling, though, in the overall approach of the Prime Minister's press conference, I thought he had a good day. I thought this was overall a good package, but I thought the overall tone of the press conference, because some of the details that you described were missing, is that he's trying to bide for time. He's trying to continue to purchase goodwill with Canadian stakeholders and set up a process for an ongoing discussion and dialogue, and sort of keeping the family together, keeping the solidarity together, while they're trying to broker something with the United States. But obviously the President's attention is focused on the conflict between Israel and Iran, and he seems obviously quite distracted by that. So I thought it was a good day, minus some specifics. The specifics that were announced, as I said, the separating of the two industries was positive policy, good outcome. Support for workers, positive policy, good outcome. I'm curious about the procurement piece and how that's going to be enforced with provinces, because you see the province of British Columbia going sideways on the procurement of ferry vessels out here and the heat that they're getting on that. It's a little bit complicated, but you see the public wants to see Canadian steel being purchased and procured by Canadian provinces, and it's not happening so far. So some movement in that direction is positive. So overall, a good day. Seems to be a stand-pat move. I think Canadians should be comforted by the Prime Minister's remarks.
Yeah, John, my sense on the procurement stuff is that it's mostly at the federal level, primarily in the defense sector, based on my interview just now with the Industry Minister, Mélanie Joly, and certainly if any foreign companies want to come in and supply the Canadian military, they'll have to use Canadian steel and aluminum in their products. So you can say it's a bit of protectionism, battling protectionism, it seems, which is what Donald Trump has unleashed. I mean, what are your thoughts on what we saw here today?
I tend to agree with almost everything James said, and so we're having a day where conservatives and liberals tend to be agreeing, or maybe a week. I think this is what people were expecting from Mark Carney. It's measured, it's thoughtful, there's a plan, but obviously this is also part of buying time. It's 30 days, so I don't know what that means. We have 28 days left, 27, and we'll see what happens. You don't want to provoke Donald Trump, because part of his negotiation style is not based on anything other than an emotional reaction. So provoking him is counterproductive. On the other hand, you can't just stand pat and have no measures to, deal with domestic industry and make it clear that you're there to, back them up. That was the elbows up argument of Mark Carney. So he's trying to do both at the same time. That's not easy. obviously it's all going to come to a head in 28 days or so, and you'll either see more aggressive measures. That July 21st a date is clearly what we'll have to keep an eye on. And yeah, these are just three sectors. As we know, there are tariffs on a whole bunch of other things that are impacting Canadians, and they're not really addressed today. I think this was to deal with a lot of the pressures coming from, the major steel and aluminum companies saying you're not doing enough. We saw that they still said there's not enough, but at least there was a move on some of maybe the dumping, other, foreign steel in particular that's coming into Canada that doesn't make much sense at this point, that we're just allowing to happen. So these are measured steps, and I think that's what we're going to see for the next few weeks. And then I think we'll have an agreement, or all bets are off.
Yeah, they've got some moves there on tariff rate quotas, limiting the amount of steel that can come in. Anything above the 2024 levels from countries without trade agreements, they get hit with the U.S. tariffs to stop a surge in dumping. But some of the bad actors the steel industry points to are trading partners, South Korea, Vietnam. So there's limits there. But, Cheryl, I don't know what it is about what Mark Carney's done to Canadian politics. It seems to have Liberals and Conservatives agreeing a lot. What about a New Democrat? How do you view this today?
Yeah, I mean, earlier this week when we heard this arbitrary 30-day deadline, I think a lot of people rightfully asked, and then what happens? What happens if it doesn't go ahead? And today we have those answers. And there is a little bit of nuance in terms of pivoting from being completely reactionary in Canada's negotiating position to saying Canada's going to take some steps to stabilize Canada's economy. And it just so happens that's not that helpful to the U.S. And I think politically speaking, Mark Carney is making good on some of the things that he promised, and actually every party promised throughout the election campaign, which is we're going to diversify our economy. We're going to find other trading partners. We're going to be less reliant on the United States. Granted, this one move today, or this package today, is not a magic wand that solves all of those objectives at once. But I think it is a reasonable first step, leaving ourselves some room to negotiate should we not make the progress that we're hoping for.
Shachi, how do you see it? How do you think the broader Canadian public is looking at this approach to dealing with sector-specific things and the Trump issue writ large?
I mean, I think right now on the first part of that, on the second part of that, I'll take the second part first. They're processing, right? They're trying to get and understand the information in real time in the same way that everybody, that all of us are, and trying to understand, what does that mean if you are a steel worker? Like if you are in the middle of the union, what does that mean if you're in the aluminum sector? What does that mean if you are in a community that works in a business that supports or serves these industries, or the population whose jobs depend on these industries? So there's a lot to sort through. I think the overarching message that came out of today, although he didn't say the phrase, maybe thank goodness, because we've heard it enough, is, we've got your back, or I've got your back, or the Prime Minister or Canada's got your back, whatever it is. But it's a signal to say that, look, you know what, we're going to take some measures that we said that we would in order to protect and preserve these industries as we try to get to the broader we as government tries to get to the bottom of what lies in terms of this trade dispute. But I think the other thing that I noticed through this, with the 30 days and maybe it'll go up or maybe it'll go down depending on how things go with the talks, is that is very much mirroring the approach that the Trump administration made 2-3 months ago when they started with their tariffs. It's like, hey, if you do nice, maybe I'll rack some of those tariffs back. If you bend the knee appropriately or make the right noises, I'll reciprocate. And if you don't, I won't make it better. Maybe I'll make it worse. We're saying it maybe in a more the Canadians are saying it in a better packaged way, in a more graceful way. But it is very much mirroring the same type of strategy that we saw coming out of Washington, and I think that's of note. We'll see how it works.
Well, hopefully this one's a little bit more strategic and consistent than what we saw. I can't imagine Mark Carney with a big prop chart going through things like Trump did, but let's hope. But, James, I wonder, talking to Mélanie Joly, and you look at how they're talking about restructuring sort of the domestic market for steel and aluminum into defense procurement, maybe, creating components specifically for the Canadian auto sector. That, I understand the necessity of that, but that is then putting higher labor cost inputs into those particular sectors. It seems like it is going to make things more expensive. That's not a criticism. That's just, it seems like the natural outcome of where this reorientation of these industries is going to lead.
Yeah, I mean, look, we have a mixed economy, and there are times when the government has to intervene and put in some liquidity and to counterbalance measures that are unfair and frankly illegal from the United States when it comes to trade. But my free market, free enterprise, hairs in my neck stood up a little bit listening to Minister Joly's conversation with you. And Frank, and I don't mean this to be a cheap shot in any way, but frankly, the longer she talked, the more confused I got. The longer she explained, the more she needed to sort of re-explain. It wasn't clear. It wasn't concise. And I think we get into the dangerous ground here of government trying to be busy for the sake of being busy so they can say that they're being busy so that we're all reassured that they're being busy. And you get into the point where the medicine can kill the patient when you try to sort of overly inject government interventions into these things. Workers need support. The businesses need market access. And in the long term, we need stability in terms of what the nature of our market access relationship is with the United States. Those are kind of the three main components. Trying to sort of gerrymander the supply chain and guarantee outcomes and percentages and inputs, the government is not good at that. And with respect to Minister Joly, she has no experience in doing that. The government doesn't have experience in doing that. That is not their strong hand. Their responsibility is to open up markets, provide as much certainty as they can in the long term, and support workers who are unfairly being punished because of trade actions by the United States. Stick to those three things and do those things well, and that'll get us through a lot of this storm.
But Jono, the free market tenants James outlined there aside, when the U.S. is just blasting the world with protectionism and forcing everyone else to have measures and countermeasures and pivots and realignments, whether you want to do it or not, you're almost forced into some form of this, and it seems like that's how they view things at this moment.
Well, I think two things can be true at the same time. I think absolutely we want to be pivoting and finding new markets. Where are we going to export steel, aluminum, many other things? It's not a new question necessarily, but obviously it's on overdrive right now. We need to be increasing it massively. These should be short-term fixes. We just don't have the market in Canada to be able to support the entire steel and aluminum industry just by forcing purchasing of local. Now, when it comes to defense, let's see what happens next week in the Canada EU and NATO meetings. There's the new I don't know what it's called. The
Rearm Europe.
Rearm. Thank you.
Yeah.
I got stuck on that. The Rearm Europe. There'll be procurement opportunities that are not just Canadian. There'll be Canadian buying European, maybe Europeans buying Canadian.
Right.
What will they use? Where will steel and aluminum be involved? So those are right away opportunities. The thing is that what we really need is a little time to build those new markets, to find those new opportunities, but we don't have the time. So we're trying to find short-term fixes that are not ideal. But I think, like I said, you can do both, and you just have to balance them out and not get stuck in it where you're trying to control industry. Yeah, I agree with James. Government is not good at that.